Hello everybody, Jesse here from JRoussel.Creations. Today's video is going to be a bit different as we are learning how to do foundation paper piecing. This will be in parallel with the Squeak block from our Witch Quilt in the Craftville sponsored Witch Along. If you would like to follow along, this is a great way to learn some of the basics to do foundation paper piecing. So, to get started, basics of what you'll need for a foundation paper piecing setup. You need a cutting mat. You need something to cut with, generally a basic ruler that you'll be using. I suggest getting a dedicated rotary cutter because you will be cutting through paper and fabric, so it will dull your blade a little bit faster than normally. You'll need your ironing surface and iron. I just have a simple project iron that I use dedicated to it. There is no steam and it gets really hot. And I have just a small dedicated ironing board off to the side here that I made out of a piece of wood, some leftover batting, and some muslin. It does get a little tarnished because you're going to be ironing the printed side of your templates face down. So the toner or ink will transfer over sometimes. You don't need anything special. You'll need your fabric, of course. You'll need your foundation templates. I like to use a bit of Elmer's purple glue. It's just a water-soluble glue, and I've found that the purple variant is a lot easier to pull because it has a very low tack. You'll need some sort of hard cardboard surface. I'm using just a packaging cardboard from a quilting ruler template that I have, but you could use an old file folder, you could use a piece of template plastic, anything that will give you a hard edge, and this is used to fold your template paper to give it a nice crisp line. An extra but not necessary if you have a regular cutting ruler is the add a quarter ruler, which if seen from the top gives you just a little lip to hook your template and paper into, that you get a nice straight line on your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, this is something nice to have, but not necessary to do foundation paper piecing if you have a regular ruler with 1/4 inch increments. So, to get started, you'll need to print your foundation paper piecing templates. They will be reversed to what the pattern will actually give you. Here is what our Squeak block will look like. Head, ear, body, tail. We're going to be starting with the center today because it is 2 simple blocks. Foundation paper piecing is nice to do when the pattern itself will end up being a bit complex. Say with the tail here, the angles that we're having to sew aren't really nice to have to cut and try and piece in traditional forms. And so with that, we use the paper templates in foundation paper piecing to get those exact points and those exact precise angles without having to paper piece by hand with English paper piecing. So, to get started, we are going to take our body fabric, which for me is this nice brown. We're going to flip our template over. Actually, I'm going to cut a piece a bit bigger than the size of the template itself, just so that I have a bit of extra and that I know I'm not going to go and not have enough when it comes time. As you can see, the entirety of my paper template fits over top without any issues, and I even have overage outside the seam allowance lines of the template. So, to start, you're going to turn your paper template face down on your cutting mat. You're going to apply just a bit of glue on the template, and then you're going to take your number 1 fabric and you're going to place it face up on the template. So far, so good. Next, we're going to take our straight edge. We're going to lie it across our stitching line, and we're going to fold the paper template over back onto itself. So that way, we can take our ruler, line that fold line up to the 1/4 inch, and trim off our excess. This then allows us to unfold the paper, turn it over, use our ear fabric, which is this nice peachy pink, and we're going to, again, cut off a bit more than we need, just so that we know we have enough. When you're starting out with foundation paper piecing, I will always suggest cutting more than you need, because some angles can be a bit tricky. Now, you're going to fold your template over, and here's where a lot of people get a bit confused, because they'll want to place all of the fabric that's going to be in the piece seems nope, this is the wrong fabric. I should be using background. I even marked it to myself. So we are going to be taking some of our background fabric instead, and we're just going to do the same thing. We're going to cut a piece that's much larger than we need and place it on the fabric. Now, again, as I was saying, some people will try and put the fabric there so that they get a bit mistaken and think that this is the piece that will end up over here, but in actuality, this is the piece that will end up folded over. So the easiest way I've found is to keep your paper folded over underneath your other fabric, and then you're going to line up your seam line, or rather, your new cut edge that you did. You're going to take both your fabrics, unfold your paper, and here's where the tricky part comes in. You're going to hold it, all 3 layers, and flip it over so that you're looking at the printed side of your paper. You should still be able to see the raw edges of both fabrics, and then we're going to take it over to our machine and stitch down the line. You're going to, on your sewing machine, shorten your stitch length. I generally stitch for FPP at a 1.5, just so that it punches a lot through the fabric and makes it easier to remove the paper afterwards. For easy blocks like this, where you have access to your seam allowance lines, I would start in the seam allowance and backtrack a bit. So if you've ever made garments, this is essentially when you would reinforce a seam. And then we're going to backtrack before we get to it and stitch right along the line. Then when you get to the end, we're going to backtrack again, cut our fabrics, and head back over to cutting mat. And so with this, we're going to set the seam that we just did before we do anything. And we're going to iron the fabric open. There is unfortunately no pressing open of your seams during foundation paper piecing. You can go back in and press seams open after you've peeled your paper off, but to me that's always been a little excessive. So as we can see, my piece is now fully covered in fabric, but I have a lot of excess. So we're going to take just our regular ruler, and along the outside seam edges, where essentially our block ends, we're going to trim up. cutting through the paper and the fabric at the same time. And that is pretty much all you need to know about foundation paper piecing, but we will be going a bit more in depth for multi-pieces, because this is just two pieces of fabric sewn together on one seam line. And so with that, it doesn't give a lot of practice. So there we go. I will keep these types of pieces. Anything that is bigger than a ½ inch, I will keep and reuse later. Things like this that are less than a ½ inch thick aren't very useful because you will lose the entirety of the fabric in your seam allowance. So that can get put aside in our scrap pile. But we now have one piece of our rat, essentially his butt. For a bit more complex, we're going to go and start with a 3-piece. So again, the same process. We're going to be starting with the body fabric here. I'm going to cut a piece of fabric that is way bigger than I need, but slightly less big than what I would have cut for the body. We're going to flip our template over. We are going to put a bit of glue in that center spot on number 1. And we're going to put our fabric down, making sure that it covers the entire piece. So I've got plenty of room on this side, I've got plenty of room on this side, and I've got plenty of room outside the borders. Next, we're going to be adding piece 2, which is our ear. So that's our pink color that I cut earlier by mistake. And now is where the fun part happens, because we have 2 different seam lines that we have to deal with. But in fact, we only need to deal with the one that we're immediately going to sew between 1 and 2. So you take your template and you fold your paper over, and then you can go take your ruler, line up your 1/4 inch seam, trim off your excess, flip your fabric face up, and our ear piece is essentially here right now. So we're going to lie the majority of our fabric there. We're going to unfold the paper, and holding all 3 pieces together, flip it over, and transfer over to our sewing machine. And again, because I have access to the outside seam allowances, I'm going to start my stitch in the seam allowance, so that way I can backtrack. If you're doing more complex patterns where, say, your piece is starting here in the dead center, backtack again, but start backtacking at your seam allowance where you first start the seam. There's no right or wrong, and it's very much just a template. With that, you will then just continue sewing on, and no one will be the wiser when you tear out the paper. So like here, I'm coming to a point. There is no seam allowance here. So I'm just going to come to the point and then backtack in and then keep going and cut my threads. Like so. So I came directly to the point, backtracked a bit, and then cut my threads. And that's all you need to do. We're going to set our seams, press the fabric, and now it just looks like a bunch of weird rectangles, but that's okay, because now we're adding another big piece of background. I'm wondering if this is not big enough. So we're going to be using a strip that I cut earlier. We'll be using the entire width of it. FPP is really good for cutting down on scraps and leftovers, especially if you're doing patterns with a lot of small pieces, because you can get away with a lot of miserly fabric usage, I'll say. Simply because you don't need a lot of fabric. You can get away, as I was saying earlier, with enough fabric to cover the template part that you're sewing presently, as well as a 1/2 inch of seam allowance total. So we're just trimming again to get our seam allowance for part 3. We're keeping our paper folded, we're flipping everything over, and we are lining up the fabric this way. And if you want to be sure that you're lining everything up properly, unfold your fabric and see I've lined it up badly because I'm missing this part here. So the easiest way to do it is to line up your fabric this way. Give you a bit more overage. I'm going to flip the fabric over here. You have a bit more fabric on this edge here. That'll be that. But we want this fabric to be on the right side. So we want to actually turn it this way. It's a bit confusing, I know. But essentially, what you're doing is lining up your pattern piece here with the outer edges of your fabric, so that this is what we're using. This is all extra, and this we don't need. So we want extra fabric on the outside of our folded paper when the two sides of the pattern are facing each other. We're going to unfold. We're going to take our fabric over to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch down the line. And again, this one's easy because we can start and stop in the seam allowance. Sure? Always make sure your fabric isn't twisted over like I just did. So I started stitching, and I'm going to be stitching through all the layers of fabric. Now we have to get our seam ripper out, unpick those couple of threads that I did, and start again. What you can do, if that ever happens, is put a little bit of glue somewhere over here on your pattern to hold this extra piece down. I just generally flip my pattern over and make sure that the extra fabric is where it should be. I didn't do that this time. Okay. And you just start over and keep going. We press our seam. Now, before we go and fold this fabric over, we want to remove this extra bit. So we're going to fold our paper over on the stitching line, and then we're just going to trim off all the excess along our 1/4 inch seam. That's extra. We can unfold that and flip our fabric over, and when we fold it back over, everything is covered. Nope, everything is not covered. I made a mistake and didn't cut enough fabric. So I've got this little piece of triangle missing. So I've got to unpick that, add in a bit. Hold please for unpicking. As you can see, I stitched along the line, but there was no fabric. This is why I say, when you're starting out, always cut a lot more than you think you need, because even if you've been stitching as long as I have, you still end up making mistakes sometimes. one of the bonuses and banes of a smaller stitch length is when you have to unpick, it's a lot of thread, and you sometimes end up ripping the stitches out of the paper, and thus tearing the paper. So again, we can keep that. That's all very good, useful fabric, but we'll be cutting a much longer piece this time. I think I'm just going to go do something along the lines of that to be safe. So again, you want to fold your paper over, lay your fabric down, your pattern piece down, and make sure that everything is covered. So, because I don't need this, I'm going to take more fabric on this edge, but I'm still making sure that I have fabric everywhere I need it, all the way around. We're going to unfold, bring everything back to the sewing machine, and stitch down that line again. Fold the paper back over, cut off the excess. Unfold. Now we're guaranteed to have enough fabric everywhere. There we go. That's what we want to see. There you are. That's piece 2. Technically piece A. We really want to get semantics, but trim it up. And again, we're trimming along the outer edge of the block. That way we have our 1/4 inch seam allowance, which makes it easier for us to join everything up once we're done. As you can see, I'm trying to be a bit miserly and keep those strips together, but you can cut straight off and not have a problem. Actually, I think I won't do that. It'll just be easier to manage afterwards. I don't know if a lot of you have noticed, but there is an odd piece of equipment that's kind of underneath my cutting mat. This here is actually a light board, and what I generally like to do is turn it on. I'm not going to do it because it's going to blow out the camera, but what it essentially allows me to do is see my fabrics through the pattern, so that I know I have enough fabric covering all my pieces, which would have helped me avoid my little issue here. It's not necessary. Some people will use a window. Others will just use the light that's in their room. They'll hold the paper up and look at it from underneath to make sure that they're covering all the pieces. I just find it easier to have this, it's a 1/4 inch thick light board of LEDs, and underneath my clear cutting mat. Again, it's not something that is needed or recommended, but something that could be useful. So now we have 2 pieces of our squeak block. We've got the head, the ear, and the body. And next up, we're going to be cutting out the tail. So, a little, I guess, late basics on templates. you'll notice that on some, this isn't really a complex pattern because we're using two colors. So we're using the background and the tail color. Or in our body piece, we were using background, body, and ear. Some more complex patterns will have a lot of different areas. It's just a fact of isolating down and following the numbers. So you're starting with C1, you'll add C2, then add C3, then you're going to add 4, add 5, and then final with 6. And what that does is that every time you're adding, we'll start with C1, but we won't start with a perfect triangle. I'm going to start with about a rectangle of fabric. Say, this rectangle of fabric. And then in adding this piece off, we'll chop a little bit off there, and then we'll have extra pink fabric on this edge, like that. And then we'll add in part 3, and that'll chop off all this excess over here. And so just adding in the pieces, you're trimming down into the final block. Get a couple little pieces cut. And see, for something like this, I'm not going to chop off a whole huge strip of fabric. I only need like an inch of fabric. I can get away with cutting a little sliver like that, no problem. Which again is really handy when you're working with leftover scraps. So again, we're going to be working with, starting with our background piece. You know what, we're going to try and see if the light board blows anything out. Oh, that actually looks really well. Okay. So, as you can see, I don't know if you can see, yeah. So this is the fabric facing up. We're going to turn it over, but happily you can still see very faintly where my areas are. So I've got a line here that divides one part. I've got background, tail, background. So we're going to add our glue into part 1. We're going to stick our fabric onto part 1, and because we don't need anything here, I can give a bit more to the seam allowance. Just press our fabric down, flip that all over, and we're going to be folding between part 1 and 2. Ruler, add our 1/4 inch. And then we're going to be doing part 2. So we're going to take our larger piece of fabric, flip everything over so that we're facing the background. And we need to add this strip here. So we're going to take our fabric, and if this wasn't black, you'd be able to see a bit more of the shadow. But because we have this part here hanging off, we want more fabric over this way. So we're going to get a bit more fabric there. And then you can hold it over, and our seam ends about there. So take a grip on your fabric, unfold everything. Everything's still lining up, that's good. So we're going to swing over to the machine, make sure that nothing gets caught underneath. And now we're going to start stitching right at that point. So now, generally, if you're just starting out, I would hand wheel down just to be sure you're punching in the right area. I kind of know where my machine hits, so I can start pretty spot on. Now, if you don't manage to get that point right in that center, that's perfectly fine. If you start farther out, just don't back tack right away. So say if I had started past it here in the tail part, I could just stitch forward until I reach the point, stitch forward a bit farther, back tack to the point, and then continue driving on. Once I peel off those pieces, I can actually unstitch until I reach the back tack. and it won't affect anything. We're going to press our seam. I can't show you pressing seams. I've got a very limited view window, unfortunately. So that's part 2 here. Then we're going to add part 3. Going to cut off our excess. And technically, I could have used this for my second tail piece. I didn't need to cut this extra piece. So that's what we're going to do. Now, number 3 is another background. Let's see. I can't really see through that, but I know that the pattern ends about here. Is this enough to cover that? It's not. So we go and we look for a scrap of fabric that will work. This is severely overkill, but we know it'll be enough. So we flip our pattern over so that we're sewing fabric to fabric and not fabric to paper. We're going to cover our seam. We're going to make sure that this piece here is covered in fabric. I know that my paper template ends here. I've got plenty of fabric over here. I've got my seam allowance on this edge, and I've got plenty of fabric down here because my triangle ends about here. I'm going to fold everything, swing back over to the machine. Now, for your points and everything, sometimes it might be easier to start when you're learning, to start in the seam allowance and then drive to the point and stop. That might be a bit easier. We could have done that with the seam here. All just about rotating your fabric and making sure that your pattern's facing the right way. There we go. Set the seam, press it open. And here we are for part 3. Now, as you can see here, the shadow of the fabric is way bigger than what we needed, but better to have more than not enough. Next, we're going to sew the seam line between parts 1 and 4. You can see now I've got a bit of that seam between 2 and 3 running over. The easiest thing to do is just pop the threads out from the paper, and that way you can fold everything over nice and easy. That doesn't damage anything, it doesn't hurt anything because your seams are all sewn and the rest is all fabric. This is tail fabric, so we're going to flip everything over, and we are sewing here. So we want our fabric to line up this way, but because we're stitching bigger to smaller, I'm going to fit the thicker part of my fabric down at the bottom. And again, this point doesn't lead into the seam allowance, but you can always make sure that your fabric covers your seam allowance, just to be sure. I've got an extra 1/4 inch on this side, and I've got an extra 1/4 inch over the outside of the paper. So we know we're covered on that edge. I'm going to straighten that up a bit. Take everything over, set the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch between part 1 and 4. Again, we'll start in the seam allowance. And back tack just to the point. There you go. We've got a lot of extra there, but our tail goes that way. So, next step, 4 to 5. paper, fold it over, cut off your extra. And now a thing to note with more complex patterns, the more complex you go and the more points add in, the thicker your seams are going to get. So sometimes you may have to change your needle for a new needle during a project. Other times you may be able to get away with it, but if ever you feel a bit of resistance, it's always easier just to add a new needle, not have to worry about it. Will this be big enough? Is this big enough? That is more than big enough. So I'm going to be a bit miserly on my fabric usage, but I know that my fabric has to cover that point, but also run along that angle. So I'm going to set my stuff up, and we're going to flip everything over. So I've got my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm past that edge. So I am good, and my fabric ends there. So everything past this is good. Unfold, grab all my layers, and we're stitching down this line here. There's the fun part where everything looks kind of weird because you've got extra fabric hanging off everywhere. But now comes the time to add the last little piece. We're going to make sure all our fabric is sticking past the seam allowance. And we're stitching on piece 6. There you are. And we'll take scrap. I think we can use this because none of my other triangles are big enough. Actually, strip. Fill up. So keep your fabric over. Hold that to the good side, and we're going to lay our fabric with raw edge to raw edge. Unfold. Flip everything over. Hold on to your loose edges, make sure that they're still visible. So your last seam. Your seams, and then I want this open. And that all works because I'm inside my seam allowance. There we go. Oop. I seem to have overshot a little bit. Nope. There will be a correction in the pattern. So you're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because or else you end up with a little extra bit there. I didn't think about that. Point about recording this while I'm making the pattern. So yes, background, tail piece, then you can do your 3 background pieces. All that will be in the pattern corrected. Just follow your numbers. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As this is just a demo, I don't mind having that little piece be a bit extra, because I can correct that later. 3 of your block pieces. You're simply going to sew them together along the seam lines. And then after that, you can remove your papers or keep the papers in and just remove the seam allowance lines. That is very much up to you. I generally like to keep my papers in until I am done adding essentially any blocks surrounding it, kind of like FPP, where you don't want to remove your template before you have the piece surrounded by other supported fabrics, just to ensure that they're all getting tacked down properly. Tail goes here. There you are, a finished squeak block. Just pull out your papers and repeat 2 more times. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I will be sure to get them answered as soon as I can. And yeah, again, this little issue will be fixed in the actual pattern release. Don't worry about that. Just follow along with the numbers and go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, and everything will be good. Yeah, have a good day. Bye.